Midnight visitors. The cabin sat deep in the woods, isolated from the world, where no one could hear the sound of champagne corks popping or New Year's resolutions being made. Alex, Mira, and their two friends, Ben and Clara, had rented it for a quiet celebration away from the city. Snow blanketed the ground outside, the moon casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. Inside, a small fire blazed in the hearth, and a vintage radio played crackling tunes from the 1940s. The group toasted to the upcoming year, their laughter filling the cozy space. By 11:30 p.m., the mood had shifted. The old radio, which had worked perfectly earlier, began to emit strange static interspersed with faint voices. At first, they thought it was a transmission from a distant station, but the voices weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any language they recognized. "It's probably interference," Ben said, adjusting the dial. "These old things pick up all kinds of weird signals." But the voices grew louder, and Mira swore she heard her name whispered through the static. "Turn it off," Clara said, her voice trembling. Ben complied, twisting the knob until the room fell silent again. That was when the knocking began. It came from the front door, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin. The group exchanged uneasy glances. No one had seen another soul for miles during their drive up, and the snow outside was undisturbed. "Who would be out here in this weather?" Mira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. He saw nothing but darkness. No figures, no movement, just the cold, silent night. "There's no one there," he said, turning back to the group. But the knocking came again, louder this time. Clara backed away, clutching her drink tightly. "Don't open it, just ignore it." Ignoring it proved impossible. The knocks grew insistent, rattling the door on its hinges. Then they stopped, replaced by scratching. Long, deliberate strokes against the wood, like claws dragging down the surface. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Ben said, grabbing a fireplace poker. He flung open the door, prepared to confront whoever, or whatever, was outside. Nothing. The snow on the porch was pristine, untouched by any footprints. Yet, as Ben stood there, a chill seeped into the cabin, and the fire in the hearth flickered weakly before extinguishing entirely. Mira gasped. "Look!" In the distance, near the tree line, figures stood motionless. Dozens of them, their silhouettes illuminated by the moonlight. They were unnaturally tall, with elongated limbs and faces obscured by shadow. One of them raised an impossibly long arm and pointed toward the cabin. "We need to leave," Clara said, her voice shaking. Alex slammed the door shut and locked it. "We can't. The car's too far and they'd see us." As the group debated their next move, the scratching started again, this time from the windows. The figures were closer now, their faces pressed against the glass. Their eyes glowed faintly, pale and unblinking. The vintage radio turned itself back on, blaring the distorted voices once more. Amid the static, a single phrase emerged, spoken in a cold, emotionless tone. "Midnight is coming." The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting down the minutes. 11:55. The cabin's lights flickered, casting the intruders in a strobe-like effect. Each time the light returned, the figures were closer, their forms twisted and unnatural. Clara screamed as one of the creatures smashed its face against the window, cracking the glass. Another began clawing at the front door, its movements frantic and inhuman. 11:58. The group huddled together, clutching whatever makeshift weapons they could find. The cabin shook violently as if an unseen force was tearing at its foundation. The radio repeated the same phrase over and over. "Midnight is coming." 11:59. The clock's hands moved slower now, dragging out the final minute. The figures surrounded the cabin, their faces pressed against every window, their mouths opening in silent screams. Midnight. The clock struck 12, and everything went silent. The radio stopped. The scratching ceased. The figures disappeared. For a moment, the group dared to hope it was over. Then came the final sound, the creak of the front door opening on its own, the final countdown. The snow fell heavily that New Year's Eve, cloaking the small town of Pine Hollow in a deep, eerie silence. The streets were deserted, save for a few flickering streetlights struggling against the swirling flakes. Inside the old abandoned lodge at the edge of town, a group of friends gathered for what they thought would be an unforgettable New Year's celebration. Emma, Jake, Lena, and Chris had been inseparable since high school. Now, in their late 20s, they rarely had time to reconnect. This year, they vowed to ring in the new year together, even if it meant spending the night in a crumbling building long rumored to be haunted. The lodge was cold, its walls lined with faded wallpaper and peeling paint. A massive grandfather clock stood in the corner, its pendulum swinging with a steady metallic clang. A fire crackled weakly in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced like wraiths across the room. Legend says the clock chimes 13 times at midnight, Lena said, her voice hushed. And whoever hears the 13th chime disappears forever. Jake scoffed, pouring himself another drink. It's just a story. Old people trying to keep kids away from this place. Emma, sitting close to the fire, hugged her knees. Still, it's creepy. Why 13? Clocks don't even have 13. Chris grinned, holding up his phone. How about we record it? If it chimes 13 times, we'll have proof. As the minutes ticked by, the group's laughter and chatter gradually faded. The atmosphere grew heavier, the cold seeping into their bones. At 11:50, the wind outside howled, rattling the window panes. Emma thought she saw a figure standing just beyond the glass, but when she looked again, it was gone. At 11:59, the group gathered around the grandfather clock. The pendulum seemed to move slower now, as if dragging time itself. Chris pressed record on his phone, and they waited. Dawn. The first chime echoed through the lodge, loud and resonant. Dong. A second chime followed, then a third. The sound seemed to grow louder, almost deafening. Dong, dong. By the 10th chime, the air in the room felt electric, charged with an unseen force. The shadows cast by the fire grew darker, sharper. Dong, dong, dong. 12 chimes. Midnight. The friends exhaled, laughing nervously. See? No third. Chris's words were cut off as the clock's pendulum stopped abruptly. Then came the 13th chime. The sound was wrong. Low, guttural, like the groan of something ancient awakening. The fire in the hearth extinguished itself, plunging the room into darkness. Emma screamed as the shadows began to move, reaching out with clawed hands. Jake's flashlight flickered to life, revealing the faces of his friends. Chris was gone. In his place stood a grotesque figure, its eyes hollow and its mouth stretched in an eternal scream. The clock chimed again, 14 times, 15. The walls of the lodge began to crack, black ichor seeping from the fractures. Lena was pulled into the darkness, her cries swallowed by an otherworldly roar. Emma and Jake bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. They turned back to see the clock, its face now a swirling void. The hands of the clock spun widely, and the pendulum moved backward, faster and faster. "You can't leave," a voice whispered. It was Chris's voice, but distorted, inhuman. The lodge began to collapse in on itself, the walls folding inward as if consumed by the void. Emma clung to Jake, tears streaming down her face. This isn't real. This isn't real. The clock struck one last time, its final chime echoing into silence. When the townsfolk came looking for the friends the next day, they found nothing but snow-covered ruins. The lodge was gone, as if it had never existed. But at the stroke of midnight the following year, residents reported hearing distant chimes, 13 of them, carried on the cold wind. And those who listened too closely swore they could hear faint, desperate screams. The resolution game. The invitation arrived on December 31st, slipped under Clara's apartment door in an unmarked black envelope. It contained a single white card with gold embossed letters. You're cordially invited to the resolution game. Midnight, Baker Street Manor. Winner receives their heart's deepest desire. Attendance is mandatory. Clara stared at the card, a chill running down her spine. Baker Street Manor had been abandoned for decades. She had no idea who sent the invitation, but her name was written on the back in elegant script. She thought about tossing it out, but curiosity got the better of her. At 11:30 p.m., she found herself standing at the gates of the decrepit mansion. Its towering silhouette loomed against the night sky, its windows glowing faintly. Clara wasn't alone. Others stood outside, clutching identical invitations. There were 8 of them, all looking uneasy. "I guess we're all here for the same thing," said a young man in a leather jacket. "Anyone know what this is about?" Nobody did. The group hesitated, but the mansion's doors creaked open on their own, inviting them in. Inside, the grand foyer was eerily pristine, as if untouched by time. A massive chandelier hung overhead, casting golden light on the polished floors. A long dining table stood in the center, set with 8 chairs and a strange assortment of objects: a mirror, a clock, a candle, and other curious items. At exactly 11:50 p.m., the doors slammed shut behind them. A deep, disembodied voice echoed through the room. "Welcome to the resolution game. Tonight, one of you will win. The others will pay the price." "What kind of game is this?" Clara demanded, her voice trembling. "A simple one. Each of you will state your New Year's resolution. But beware. Breaking it comes with consequences." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to leave. The first participant, a middle-aged woman named Diane, was told to sit at the head of the table. She hesitated, but the chair pulled itself out, forcing her to sit. "What's your resolution, Diane?" the voice asked. Diane swallowed hard. "To quit smoking," she said, her voice barely audible. The voice chuckled. "Very well." A puff of smoke enveloped her, and when it cleared, a cigarette appeared in her hand. "Let's see if you can resist." One by one, the others were called to the table. Their resolutions ranged from the mundane, losing weight, saving money, to the deeply personal. Clara hesitated when it was her turn, but finally said, "To stop letting fear control me." The voice laughed. "An admirable choice. But will you succeed?" When all the resolutions were made, the voice announced, "The game begins now." The clock struck midnight, and the room plunged into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, Diane was gone. In her chair was a pile of ash. The cigarette she'd been holding lay extinguished atop it. Panic erupted. "What is this?" someone screamed. The voice replied, cold and amused. Diane broke her resolution. She couldn't resist the cigarette. "You see, this game isn't about winning. It's about survival. Resist temptation. Fulfill your resolution, and you'll live. Fail, and the consequences will find you." The night descended into chaos. The group scattered throughout the mansion, each person trying desperately to avoid the traps the voice had laid for them. The man who resolved to save money. found himself surrounded by stacks of gold coins, but the moment he touched them, the walls closed in, crushing him. Another, who vowed to reconcile with his estranged sister, was haunted by a ghostly apparition of her, whispering accusations until he went mad. Clara roamed the halls, her heart pounding. Whispers followed her, taunting her fears. She heard the voice of her late mother, chastising her for every mistake she'd ever made. Shadows twisted into monstrous forms, chasing her down dark corridors. But she clenched her fists and pressed on, refusing to let fear consume her. By dawn, only Clara remained. She stumbled back into the foyer, trembling but alive. The voice returned, softer now. Congratulations, you've won the resolution game. Your reward awaits. A golden key appeared on the table. Clara hesitated but picked it up. The front door creaked open and sunlight spilled in. She left the mansion, never looking back. But as she walked away, she realized something chilling. The voice still echoed in her mind, a sinister whisper that would never leave. Her resolution had been fulfilled, but at what cost?